Hola, buenas tardes. Para hacer muy breve estas ceremonias de inauguración, yo soy el enemigo número uno de las inauguraciones, pero el profesor Boris puso mi nombre, entonces yo nada más quiero aprovechar la ocasión para agradecer al embajador de Inglaterra, Giles Paxman, que es muy buen amigo del colegio, que está otra vez con nosotros. Giles, embajador, encantadísimo. Y a Jonathon Porrit, que es pues una celebridad en el mundo, así que es para el Colegio de México un orgullo tenerlo aquí. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Así que eso es todo lo que tengo que decir. Embajador, mil gracias, Giles, saludos. Y
bueno, muchas gracias, Javier. Les voy a decir lo que vamos a hacer en estas 2 horas y media. Quiero agradecer la presencia del embajador, por supuesto, de Jonathon Porrit, de José Luis Lezama y de nuestra directora que dijo que se iba a sentar. Gracias, Silvia. Quiero decirles que invitamos a Jonathon a dar una plática. Originalmente habíamos previsto que íbamos a tener una sesión tipo mesa redonda, pero bueno, hay mucha gente interesada en venir y entonces es difícil tener una mesa redonda. Entonces, por eso está el arreglo de esta manera. Quiero decirles que estamos invitando a una lista de colegas interesados en nuestras actividades que tienen que ver con cuestiones ambientales, tanto la lista de los egresados de LEAD, que son bastantes, no les voy a decir el número, también una lista de interesados en los seminarios sobre medio ambiente que se organizan por iniciativa de José Luis Lezama desde hace ya algunos años, cada mes o algo por el estilo, y tenemos a los asociados de la 14ª generación del programa LEAD, porque tenemos una actividad semanal, toda la semana tenemos un programa, la primera semana del programa LEAD. También quiero decirles que estamos proyectando esta sesión al Colegio de la Frontera, y nos van a estar viendo ahí, y también a la Universidad de Guadalajara. En ambas instituciones tenemos egresados del programa, entonces yo estoy presumiéndolo porque en el programa que ustedes recibieron, ahí dice clarito, Programa de Estudios Avanzados en Desarrollo Sustentable y Medio Ambiente LEAD-México. I want to say that Jonathon Porrit is a friend of LEAD. In fact, there is a email that I received from Simon Lister, who is our secretary at London, saying that I should take care of the whole thing, and I was going to be watched. So I'm not sure if I'm taken care of, but what I want to say is that we're very glad that you are related in some way with our international program, and thank you very much. I think we will ask you, Jonathon, to give a talk, but I would like to ask first José Luis Lezama to present a very brief bio of Jonathon Porrit, a short bio, so that people know exactly some of the background and some of the activities that you have been involved in. Okay?
Gracias, Boris. Voy a leer una hojita nada más en español. Jonathon tiene la versión, the English version of my presentation. Muchas gracias al embajador Paxman por su presencia, a Jonathon. Muchas gracias. Jonathon Porrit es ya una leyenda en el movimiento y en el pensamiento ambiental británico. Nació en Londres en 1950, estudió en Eton College y en el Magdalen College, Oxford. Fue miembro y después presidente del Green Party, anteriormente conocido como el UK Ecology Party, que a su vez deriva del antiguo People Party fundado en 1973 considerado el primer partido verde del mundo. En 1984 fue nombrado director de la sección británica de Friends of the Earth hasta 1990. En 1996 fundó el Forum for the Future con Sarah Parkin y Paul Ekins. En el año 2000, el primer ministro Tony Blair lo nombró presidente del UK Sustainable Development Commission. Jonathon Porrit, además de líder y activista ambiental, es autor de varios libros, entre los que destacan Seeing Green de 1984, The Reader Digest Good Beach Guide de 1994, Liberty and Sustainability de 1995, Playing Safe, Science and Environment del 2000 y Capitalism as If the World Matters del 2005. Es miembro de incontables asociaciones ambientales, filantrópicas y de concientización ambiental. Tony Blair, antiguo primer ministro británico, lo llamó su gurú verde. Después de leer su libro Seeing Green de 1984, yo también lo hice mi gurú ambiental. En este libro, que es ahora ya un clásico de la literatura ambiental, sobre todo desde la perspectiva de la ecología política, Jonathon Porrit sitúa la crisis ambiental contemporánea como una consecuencia no deseada de la sociedad industrial y de la modernidad en general, de sus valores y de la concepción utilitarista que tiene del medio ambiente, más que como un simple resultado de sus expresiones concretas en el capitalismo o en el socialismo. Para él, ambos sistemas han resultado bastante exitosos en la destrucción del medio ambiente. Jonathon, bienvenido al Colegio de México. Welcome to el Colegio de México.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for my English version. I'm delighted to have an acolyte with me here this evening. If I am your guru, you must be my acolyte.
You really are.
That's slightly scary, actually, but still. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. As you heard, I am indeed a friend of LEAD. I've known about the organization for a long time, in fact, pretty much from the start, and have always admired enormously the quality of care that this organization brings to the intellectual life training that LEAD associates and indeed fellows are able to benefit from. So I think it is a wonderful organization, and I feel people who have contact with it and continue to stay in contact with it are very privileged. It's a wonderful set of insights that you gain through involvement in a network of this kind. So I thought we were going to be having a nice informal discussion this evening, with a few sofas gathered around, chat a little bit about sustainability and capitalism and the planet and politics and life and all the rest of it. So I have come slightly unprepared in terms of a formal talk, but I shall hopefully make up for that by needing to improvise a little. And I thought I'd actually just reflect a little bit on the session that we had this morning. We were lucky enough to have this morning at UNAM, at the university there, where we had a splendid presentation from an academic, eminent academic, who showed us how hard it is today for politicians to win any trust at all around this agenda because of the lack of trust, because of the degree to which people sort of start from the assumption that you really shouldn't believe a politician, because he or she is a politician, and therefore, are you really going to believe them? And this was a sort of table of people who you would most trust to tell you about the state of the planet today and what we should be doing about it. I think we were all, from the UK, we were all particularly astonished to find that the category, the most trustworthy category in Mexico in terms of information that you receive about things, were firefighters. This was a little bit weird. We were told that the connection between firefighters and global warming was a very direct one, and therefore we shouldn't be too surprised. But when you went through the table, of course, politicians came way down. Now, this is actually an immensely significant problem. If we don't trust those who we elect into positions of power and influence, it's very hard to see how civil society is going to make the journey it needs to make to arrive at a sustainable future. And we need our politicians more than ever before over the next few years, because the journey that I'm talking about here is a far more challenging journey than anything that humankind has ever confronted in the whole history of humankind. It is that scale of endeavor that we are really talking about today. And I suppose not just because I'm in Mexico, but I've occasionally likened this to clashing tectonic plates. And you have these two plates today rubbing up against each other all the time, constant friction, and occasional extremely traumatic geological effects as a consequence of that tectonic movement. And the two plates that we're talking about here are two different paradigms of progress. One is the paradigm of progress that emerged from the start of the Industrial Revolution, although some people would take it right back to the Enlightenment, and some would take it back even to the start of Judeo-Christian thinking and philosophy. But let's go back to the start of the Industrial Revolution. That's far enough for tonight. And that model of progress essentially said humankind is the dominant species on the planet. The planet is there essentially for our use. What we need to do is to refine the sophistication by which we use the planet, extract matter from it, use its resources, grow human numbers, make a better life for human beings. And what really matters is to increase the sum of economic prosperity, economic wealth available to humankind through the use of the natural world. That model of progress is now incredibly strong. It is deeply rooted in every society in the world. Doesn't really matter what other society you're talking about, you'll find the same paradigm of progress, differentially interpreted, but the same paradigm of progress working at the heart of that society. And nowadays we simplified it. Really, since the end of the Second World War in the 20th century, we simplified it, and we simply said what we need is more economic growth every year. Through that economic growth, we will increase the per capita well-being of individuals on the planet, and through that increase in growth and the increase in well-being, we will meet human needs and we will allow the human species to prosper. It is an incredibly simple paradigm of progress. And it overwhelms everything else. At our presentation this morning, there was a sense of sinking despair at the prospect that Mexico is only going to grow by 1.5% in 2009. And I got the feeling, listening to the economist who was explaining this, that this was sort of shameful, not just bad, as in it will be difficult to negotiate politically, but shameful. Because a nation obviously demonstrates its worthiness to its citizens by the degree of economic growth that it can generate year on year. And that is the principal reporting mechanism for governments in terms of are we doing well or are we doing badly. If we're growing our economy at 3, 4, 5%, you're doing well. If you're growing at 1.5%, you're not doing well at all, really. If in our circumstances, you're degrowing your economy or declining your economy by possibly as much as 2% next year, which will certainly be the case for many European countries, and indeed for America itself, then this is, of course, total failure. Absolute, total, irredeemable failure. That you have so crashed the economy that that's the outcome. So this model of progress is dominant, it is universal, it is embedded in our minds, we don't think about it any longer. If people said to you, my dream for the human species is that we will learn to improve our lot here on Earth without any economic growth at all, you would all think you were talking to a madman, quite literally. So it's deeply, deeply embedded. And of course, we now know what that paradigm of progress has done for us. We understand today the unsustainability impacts. They're all around us. I'm not going to go through that list this evening. It's a very gloomy list. It's very depressing stuff. It's amazing that environmentalists can smile at all, if you ask me, let alone tell the odd joke. They are surrounded by doom and gloom. And it doesn't really get any better. If I was doing a PowerPoint presentation tonight, I have a slide that simply says, Death of Nature. This was a wonderful book written by a man called Bill McGibbon 20 years ago, in which he pointed out the incremental damage, cumulative damage of human civilization, growth-based human civilization on the natural world. And those stresses go on all the time, whether we're talking about water or soil or forests or fisheries or biodiversity or ecosystem services. It doesn't really matter. They just get worse every year, okay? And they get worse every year for a very simple reason, because there are more of us every year. There are 75 million additional human beings every year. And every single one of us wants to get a bit richer every year. Whether you're coming from the poorest part of the world or the richest part of the world, everybody wants to be a little bit better off at the end of the year than they were at the start of the year. So it's very simple, this. This isn't complicated stuff. I sometimes wonder why people get so muddled about this. It's incredibly simple. If you grow the numbers of the dominant species every year, and you then expect to grow by a given amount every year, the physical environment is going to be in trouble. And we are in terrible trouble. Add to that now climate change, which of course is the big issue that the human species is having to cope with. I sometimes think we get climate change out of perspective because it is so important. We see it as something special in its own right. It isn't something special in its own right. It is another symptom of the reluctance, indeed the total denial on the part of humankind to live compatibly in sympathy with with natural systems. Climate change is but the latest symptom of all of those different impacts. So to cut that bit of my talk short, if we carry on creating wealth in the way that we create it now, basically every expectation you may have for a better world, for yourself, for your communities, for your family, for the whole of humankind, are completely worthless. Just completely worthless. We are looking at an apocalyptic collapse of human civilization if we continue on the path that we are on today. And I wish I could offer you a slightly different picture, but I can't. That's the truth. If the paradigm of progress that we're dependent on today, exponential economic growth on an annual basis, we're finished as a civilization. We're probably not finished as a species. You'll probably find remnant human communities hanging on in the northern and southern extremities of the planet, which would probably be the only bits of the planet which will still be habitable once the temperature increase goes above 10 degrees centigrade, which is what might well happen with runaway, irreversible climate change. So I'm not really sure that we can make ourselves extinct. We'd have to work a little bit harder to make ourselves extinct. We'd probably need a combination of runaway, irreversible climate change, total nuclear meltdown, unanticipated diseases, all these kind of things. We probably need to do it all at the same time to make ourselves completely extinct. And equally, although we are quite rightly very concerned about biological diversity, and Mexico obviously very conscious of its role in that regard as the fourth most biodiverse country in the world, we don't have to worry too much about biodiversity on a long time scale. The planet and the species that make up this planet will see us out. We don't really have to worry about life on Earth. When I hear environmentalists say that humankind now threatens life on Earth, that is a rhetorical flourish which is completely meaningless. Life on Earth will continue whatever we do to it. There have been 5 extinctions, mass extinctions on the planet. In 3 of them, more than 90% of the life forms on the planet at that time were exterminated, became extinct. And yet, after each extinction spasm, nature built back up the diversity and the resilience of the natural systems, and indeed on every occasion we ended up with a more biodiverse world, we think, than was the case before the extinction spasm. So from a philosophical point of view, don't worry about life on Earth, okay? Don't worry about biodiversity. It's okay. It's very arrogant of us to think that we're going to be able to manage life on Earth for the next 3.5 billion years. This is a bit of a sad fantasy, okay? In the short term, however, yes, we ought to worry about biodiversity because we owe it to the creatures with which we share this planet to do a rather better job than we are doing today. So that's paradigm of progress 1. Paradigm of progress 2 is what I call the sustainability revolution, is this very different approach to how we meet human needs and satisfy the potentiality in each human being, and we do it very differently. We don't do it through the paradigm of economic growth that we have today. We do it through a different pattern of economic development. We cohabit with nature rather than subjugate and dominate nature. We share the wealth that we have much more fairly between the whole of humankind. We don't put up any longer with living in a world where 1 billion people are incredibly well off, very rich, very privileged, and the rest of humankind essentially still struggling to make for a decent life. The 1 billion rich people today are the 1 billion people who've taken human civilization to the brink of collapse. So there may still be some who think that we can have that kind of cornucopian prosperity for another 5 billion people, or another 8 billion people by 2050, when human population will have reached 9 billion. These are fantasies. These are complete fantasies. There are fantasists out there. There are people who believe we can really do it. The calculations are incredibly simple. If 9 billion people were to live like the richest Mexican citizen today, I'm not personalizing this, whoever that might be, okay, well, that little elite that you have at the top of your society, like we have at the top of our society, if 9 billion people with whom we share the planet by 2050 were to live that kind of lifestyle, we would need 18 planets. 18. I've done this calculation. The Worldwide Fund for Nature reminds us that even today we'd need 3 or 4 planets to live like Californians live today. And if you really want to push the calculation, you can get to a figure of 18 different planets. There's ambition for you. Well, you all recognize this. You know this. You know that this is just completely and utterly insane to have a model of progress that depends on finding 17 more planets. It is just insane. I look at people today and I think, which bit of the brain have they managed to turn off? How have they done this? How can they look at these figures, look at the statistics, see what's happening, and yet still say, well, we've got a bit of a problem with our model of progress at the moment, but we're going to tweak it a bit. We're going to improve it. We're going to make it better. We're going to protect a little bit more biodiversity. We're going to cut a few greenhouse gases. And hey presto, the model of progress will be okay. I think it's unbelievable. Our lives are full of fantasists, people who just drift through life without ever making contact with reality. Now, I have lots of reasons for this. I blame economists mostly, but I won't go into that this evening. Okay, so 2 paradigms of progress clashing. Increasingly, aggressively clashing. As more and more people become aware of the insanity of the existing paradigm of progress, and more people begin to think, we should be able to do this differently, we want to do it differently, those clashes will become more pronounced. They will become more destabilizing in society. More people will simply refuse to sign up to the status quo that is based on such outright fantasy. It will be a massively challenging time. And we will need politicians to help steer us through that clash of political tectonic plates. So we badly need to rebuild trust between ourselves and our politicians, between civil society and the political system on which we depend. We badly need to think about how to do that, how to put the trust back into the system. How do we universalize the Obama factor? I mean, not just did he have an amazing election campaign, but if you look at the opinion polls in America, the thing that stands out most is how he rebuilt trust in the political system. And if you look at the start of the election campaign, and the surveys in America demonstrate that no more than about 20 to 24% of people had any trust any longer in the political system to deliver a decent democratic set of responses to their needs. Less than 25% of people in America. Theoretically, the cradle of the democratic world, as it were. After the Obama effect, the election campaign, when he came into the White House, that figure has gone to 60%. Now, I'm not saying that's solely down to him, but it is an extraordinary thing to look at. And we're very dependent on doing that. Okay, so I've probably said enough now. I just want to end by reminding us that we don't really call on the full resourcefulness of humankind as we face this challenge. We're far too dependent on dreaming about technology or dreaming about magic bullet solutions to these complex systemic problems. We all need to have easy answers available to us to avoid doing the deep analysis. So I just want to invite you, and maybe we can get into this discussion now, to think about what's the full range of resources that humankind has available to it as a species to avoid this apocalyptic destination and create not some kind of utopian future, but create a good, decent, elegant, compassionate, dignified world for 9 billion people. What are those resources? And yes, we need the technology. It's hugely important. I'm a massive enthusiast of new technology for a sustainable world, don't get me wrong. But equally, we all know in our heart of hearts that technology alone is not going to do it. So how do we move our analysis out of the left hemisphere of our brains, which is all very instrumental and techie and, all rather reductionist? How do we move our thinking out of the left hemisphere into the right hemisphere and begin to think much more about these other resources available to us? Incredible cultural and artistic resources that are not called upon at all in terms of the challenge of making a sustainable world. If you think about the role that culture and the arts and creativity and literature and music, if you think about the role that these things play in our lives, we need to think far more about how that aspect of humankind will help us on this complicated journey. And I would invite you, just for the purposes of discussion, to go one step further. This is controversial, but I don't really believe that political and technology-based systems will do this all on their own. So at what point does the spiritual dimension of humankind become more active in steering our societies through to a more sustainable future? Controversial. Lots of scientists and engineers don't like to talk about spirituality, as if it was somehow a symptom of failure on the part of humankind. We are in the anniversary of Darwin, so we have to be a bit careful here. But let's be honest, the vast majority of humankind still subscribes to one form or another of a faith-based or religious-based system. Out of 6.8 billion people today, the reality is that in excess of 5 billion of those 6.8 billion still have, as part of their own humanity, a set of spiritual or religious precepts. Interesting. But you don't hear anybody talk about the role of spirituality in helping humankind avoid the apocalypse, do you? Not really. We're all a bit embarrassed to talk about that. We love to talk about technology and politics and economics and creating wealth differently. All gets very excited. But nobody really wants to talk about the potential of a spiritual transformation, of a reinterpretation of what humankind stands for, and how it is that we derive any kind of meaning and purpose in life. So rather than just do the techie bit tonight, which might be very tempting, we can have good discussions about solar power and energy efficiency and so on, I think it would be really interesting to explore a little bit what is the net sum of the resource available to humankind to undertake the single most important journey in the history of our species, which is what will dominate your lives. Absolutely dominate. It'll be the thing that dominates the life of everybody pretty soon. So that's the question I'd like to chuck out for exploration.
Great, thank you. What I am going to do is I'm going to open the floor here for a round of 5 questions. Then I will go to our colleagues in the Colegio de la Frontera and as well as in Universidad de Guadalajara. And then we will have sort of comments by Jonathon. And then if we have time, we will go and keep going for another round, okay? So I want Cesar and Norma to have the microphone to 5 people here in the audience that would like to have a comment or a question. Not very large comment, don't take too much time. Let's have it like more dynamic, okay? Please. Please, could you please give your name?
Yeah.
It would be, because we are recording that, so the people outside knows who you are.
In Spanish or in English?
Whatever you would like.
Well, I guess everybody understands English, so I'm going to try in English. I'm Francisco Aceves from Instituto Politécnico Nacional. I have been working for more than 30 years. I'm about your same age. I was born in 1950, so almost about the same about the same age. I think everybody is conscious about the problem, but almost nobody wants to change the way of life. Nobody wants to renounce to the automobile or many comforts that we have, and we know that the problem, for instance, the first enemy of the environment is the automobile, but almost nobody wants to renounce to it, and many other things. And the problem is how to combine to get the people to adhere to other technologies, more eco-techniques. I have been working for many years about this. I have developed myself some eco-techniques, but I cannot convince nobody to get these eco-techniques. I think the problem is to change the paradigms, as you said, but also to force or to combine most of the people not to utilize many technologies that are very dangerous for the environment. I would like to know your opinion about that.
Carlos de la Parra.
Good afternoon. I'm Carlos de la Parra. I come from el Colegio de la Frontera Norte. I was forced to be here because there was no place for me. There at Colef, it's all crowded, trying to see, and so they threw me out, and I came here. Very interesting. I congratulate you on our invitation of moving from left hemisphere to right hemisphere. And I'm wondering if you have specific recommendations. I can see how spirituality and music and art makes people look away from having more and sort of being more as opposed to having. And I'm wondering if you have some recommendations for a country like Mexico, who is south of the border from the most consumer country, the greatest consumer country. Back in the 1960s or thereabouts, 70s, there was an author that wrote a book that probably everybody here has learned about. It's called La Mujer Dormida Debe Dar a Luz. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's the story of one of our volcanoes, and it really describes the story of where Mexico has a role of being south of the most war-oriented society in the world and being a peaceful country. And to that extent, I would extend peace to this, renouncing consumerism and moving, but some specific recommendations that you might see for Mexico. Thank you.
Norma, señor.
¿Hay traducción simultánea?
No.
¿No?
favor.
Bueno.
Tu nombre.
Pero sí,
Puedes hablar en español si gustas.
Sí, podemos ayudar. Si
But
quieres hablar.
he won't understand me then.
Sí, en español y tu nombre, por favor.
Otto Minera. My question is this. Do you know of a country, of a society now that is an example of what you were saying? I mean, a society where culture, spirituality are really doing something to change the way we behave, the way we do things. I very much agree with you. I think that's what we should do in a much higher degree than we do now. But as he was saying, it's not easy in Mexico, and I guess it isn't easy anywhere. But could you talk a little about this? I mean, maybe in England or where in the world a society has paid attention enough to developing culture and arts and all the way of relating to another way of knowledge. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Maria Jose Soler. I belong to the 4th generation of LEAD. And well, I have a comment and also a question. You were saying that it would be very interesting to assess the sustainability or the ways to sustainability through the spirit, through spiritualism. No? But, well, certainly it won't be through praying, no? We won't get there by praying. But still, there are many rocks in the middle of the way, no? Like, for instance, to reach this, to get this idea to people who nowadays have the concept of what is sustainability, just to get there, it's a great effort, no? For us to understand what really is going on with the world and where are we going to get to if we don't wake up. Is many of us are, I don't want to generalize, but it's something that I've noticed. Many of us don't have really a strong belief in our own religious cultures, or our original religious cultures. So, and in the other way, it's the same. People, well, that's what I believe, people who are really into their religion, which will be the way into this proposal will get through, like the communication will flow. I don't think they all understand what is going on and what are the consequences. So here it's a problem of communication and understanding in the middle of the way.
Thank you.
Natalie Rodriguez from LEAD as well. You seem quite surprised that there is a lack of trust in politicians. In Mexico, unfortunately, given our history, is a common day thing. I wouldn't generalize because I'm sure there are many good politicians. But what recommendations do you have for us to be more trustworthy of our politicians? Does it have to do with how society reacts or social participation, or what was the change in Great Britain to have more trust in more politicians?
Hi, my name is Roberto Capuano. I work with Eco-Securities. However, today I'm here out of pure academic curiosity, if you will. You mentioned the two paradigms clashing against each other, paradigm one clashing against paradigm two. I believe that the paradigm one has seeped into these other areas where that you consider could be part of the solution, spirituality and music. For example, Bill McKibben's example that he quotes very, very commonly, that most Americans believe that the Bible says that God helps those who help themselves. That's in terms of spirituality. In terms of music and creativity, how, for example, the music industry in the United States is controlled by one company who follows the paradigm, that we are exactly trying to defeat with the paradigm of creativity, a new paradigm, right? So what I'm saying is, it's even hard to understand where to begin to begin to implement this new paradigm. So my question specifically would be, where and how do you see this new paradigm start to infiltrate into these fields of spirituality and creativity that are part of the solution, as you just mentioned? Thank you.
Voy a parar esta ronda y voy a pedir a la doctora Gabriela Muñoz de COLEF en Tijuana si nos puede ayudar a organizar algunas preguntas de la audiencia que estamos viendo ahí en esa mesa de Tijuana, por favor. Gabriela.
Gracias. Indeed, thank you very much for the talk. It was extremely interesting. A warm welcome from the College of the Northern Border in Tijuana, Jonathon Porrit. I have a couple of questions here, and well, let me break the protocol. I will start. Shouldn't we say, instead of religions, affairs, of issues, more in the terms of environmental ethics? Possibly that will cause less waves here in the kind of society that we are living. Excuse me, did you listen to my warm welcome, and the question?
I did. Thank you very much.
Otra pregunta.
Okay, so what do you have to say to us?
No, por favor.
Okay, and I have a second question. Yep. Okay. And the second question by Carlos Vasquez is...
Hello, actually, reasoning up your conversation regarding to the growth and economic development based on natural resource, I just realized that assumptions are based in a steady economic growth instead of a dynamic growth, which could be based in a political and institutional arrangement, or first institutional arrangement and therefore the political arrangement which should head off to the wealth of human and therefore the environment in order to provide us with a benefit in the long run. So my observation here is that everybody is talking about the economic in terms of static or steady growth instead of dynamic. We don't talk about dynamic, which I think is a big lack in this conversation. Thank you.
Okay, so we are eagerly waiting for your answer.
Well, this is a reflection of the Colegio de la Frontera Norte. It's always like that with them. If there is no other question, then I'm going to go to Guadalajara, and I'm going to ask Doctora Aida Segovia. I think it's you that is going to help us with the questions in your group. No hay sonido de Guadalajara. Bueno, si se restablece correcto, vamos a, creo que vamos a pedir there is an eager desire to listen to the answers. Everybody's excited about that. So, Jonathon, I think it's time for you to take the questions and comments.
Right. Shall I start with the questions from the Colegio de la Norte, just in case, just in case you can't wait any longer. But thank you very much for those difficult questions. And I suppose you've reminded me that when I talk about the idea of a spiritual or a faith-based dimension, I'm talking not really about a particular set of religious ideas. I thank you for your pithy comment that we won't get there by praying, and you're probably right. God knows where we will get by some of the prayers of people who live in North America, for instance. That's another story. But I think that isn't what I was trying to open up. I wasn't trying to suggest that we're all going to have to become born-again religious zealots. I was merely suggesting that there is a part of humankind that responds differently to the challenges that are put to it. And we need to nurture that set of attributes in humankind and allow them to play a bigger part in our lives. So the question that you asked me about, wouldn't it make more sense to start, for instance, with a much more sophisticated approach to environmental ethics, and to put environmental ethics absolutely at the heart of what we do today as humankind? Yes, it would make fantastically good sense. And you sort of think to yourself, we probably ought to do this anyway for instrumental reasons. Human beings usually end up protecting the natural world because they think it'll be of some benefit to them. And environmental ethics takes us into a different space beyond that, which says, in fact, that's not sufficient. That instrumental view is not enough. We have to start to respect the natural world and its diversity of creatures because of their own interest, their own importance, regardless of their value to us. There is no political system in the world anywhere today that puts that system of environmental ethics anywhere near its decision-making processes. Anywhere near it. No planning decision or planning application is ever turned down because we think that we ought to protect the rights of other creatures to thrive in their own terms. No government ever makes decisions on the basis of a sophisticated form of environmental ethics. So although I very much agree with you, the sad truth is that we normally trade off other creatures, we trade off the environment against our own interests. And we do that all the time, practically in every decision we take. Some people do it unknowingly, many people do it knowingly. So, at this part of the 21st century, environmental ethics is a powerful set of ideas, beautiful, eloquent ideas, expressive of the best bits of humankind, but they're largely absent from, invisible in our political systems. So, it's a good starting point, but we know that probably isn't going to get us to where we need to be. So I suppose I was saying we probably won't do a good job on the environmental ethics unless we start doing a better job on what we mean by being a fully developed human being. So let me come back now to the very tricky question that we think it's going to be. We think we have real difficulties telling people what sustainability is. I can't remember who asked me that question, but thank you. We're struggling still to make sense of what sustainability means. That is true intellectually, but it is not true emotionally. In 1996, 4 years after the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, the United Nations Environment Programme carried out a survey around the world of what people meant by a good life. And they asked up to 10,000 people in something like 20 countries, an extraordinary study. And the thing that we all need to be amazed by is that regardless of which country we were talking about, regardless of the wealth of that country, pretty much everybody, when they were asked to come up with the vision of a good life, came up with exactly the same things. Exactly the same things. And they were all about feeling safe in the place where I live, able to have joyful relationships with other people, able to enjoy good health, able to find a decent education for my children, able to connect with the natural world, have a bit of greenery around me. a chance to do some useful work. And attribute after attribute comes out through this survey, country after country after country. Now, they didn't mention sustainable development. They didn't say, what do you think sustainable development is? They said, what do you think a good life means? And yet, to be honest, that's exactly what sustainable development is really trying to do, is to enable people to live good lives in that way. Not a single country came back and said, increase per capita income on an annual basis. Not a single country said that the measure of a good life is the opportunity to get richer on a per capita basis year by year. Not a single country came back and said higher GDP. Not one. The division of a good life was to live in a world where our government delivered higher GDP year on year. Not a single one. So I would put the challenge back to you. I think emotionally, we have an incredibly strong sense of what a good life would look like. A good, decent, ethical life would really look like. And the tragedy is, of course, that we make it almost impossible to achieve those desirable goals because of the economy that we've put in place, theoretically to achieve them, but actually it's an economy that destroys them. So I suppose I would build from there to the work, and I hope some of you are familiar with the work of a wonderful Chilean economist, possibly the only economist I ever say anything nice about, but he is an amazing man, a man called Manfred Max Neef. And Manfred Max Neef spent 15 years of his life doing a series of anthropological and sociological studies, looking at how individual cultures anywhere in the world expressed what they meant by human need. What were these needs that people sought to meet in different places? And he came up with this challenging hypothesis, and it is still very challenging, that in fact, this set of basic human needs are common to human societies across the world, regardless of their religion, their ethnic base, their demographics, their income level. He came up with these set of 9 basic needs that he hypothesized are universalized across the whole of humankind. That's a sort of very brave thing to say, and a lot of people don't agree with that, but just go with the hypothesis for a moment. So he came up with things like security, the chance to fulfill oneself creatively, opportunities for recreation and relaxation, family, etc., etc. And then he went on to say, that may be universal, but what is not universal is how each culture then finds the means of satisfying those basic needs. And every culture has different satisfiers, as he called them, different routes to meeting those human needs. And that's where the analysis gets really interesting, because he then went on to demonstrate that because of our industrial paradigm of progress, most of us have thrown in our lot with a really bad proxy measure of meeting our needs, which is increased consumption. And his whole work is basically saying, if consumption is your proxy for meeting human needs and allowing human society to prosper, then the game is finished. Because consumption is the worst possible proxy for anything about human nature. Really powerful analysis. But of course, we've all thrown in our lot with consumption in one way or another. We all sort of subscribe to the idea that if we're feeling really down, we can go out and shop ourselves back to happiness. We sort of think that we'll be just a little bit better if we got a little bit money to spend a little bit more. So I'm not trying to be superior about this. We're all participants in this consumer culture, some more enthusiastic than others, but we are all participants in that culture. So that comes on to the question about, do I know any countries that have succeeded in living out these values, these non-consumerist, non-materialist values, and therefore lead different lives? Well, I definitely can't offer the UK. I'm sure Giles won't mind me saying this. I'm conscious with the ambassador sitting next to me. I have to be a little bit careful here. But the UK, no, definitely not. We are sold hook, line, and sinker. This is a fishing expression, but we are completely sold out to consumerist values in the UK, really to a most distressing extent. Consumption and celebrity and ephemera, superficiality. I despair of our UK culture sometimes. I'm sorry if there are some Anglophiles out there who would love me to tell you that we've sort of got this sorted, but our culture is riddled with the worst aspects of consumerism writ large. It really is. So much so that our government really wanted to stop calling us citizens and started to call us consumers. Okay, you get the measure. So not the UK, trust me on that one. Probably not America. And the only country I can really offer you, which I don't feel particularly good at offering you, is the Kingdom of Bhutan, which some of you will have heard about, which is a tiny little kingdom just to the north of India in the Himalayas. And it's rather special because it's sort of thought this stuff through. And they have an incredibly simple, wonderfully inspiring way of talking about what nationhood and citizenship means for people in Bhutan. And they don't talk about gross domestic product, they talk about gross domestic happiness, GDH, rather than GDP. And you probably think they don't take that seriously. Actually, they take it incredibly seriously. And they have quite sophisticated ways of measuring gross domestic happiness. And most policies have to sort of come up with an attempt to demonstrate how that policy will improve the well-being and the happiness of citizens, not how it will make them richer. So there was a huge fuss, for instance, when they put in the first set of traffic lights in the capital city in Bhutan. A massive fuss, because they were very concerned that putting in traffic lights would increase levels of aggression and road rage and make for less human well-being. Because at the moment there aren't that many cars in Bhutan, but they do occasionally bump into each other. So the obvious answer was to put in traffic lights. This debate went on for 18 months. I know you think this is a really stupid example, okay, because if you can't make up your mind about a set of traffic lights, what can you make up your mind about? But the debate wasn't like the debate we'd have. The debate was, is this a good thing in terms of the relationships between people? Is this going to build good relationships, trust between people? If you put traffic lights in place, you stop trusting on people not to run you down. And encouragingly, I have to tell you, in the end, they decided not to install the traffic lights on the grounds that it would actually have a small but negative impact on net human happiness in Bhutan. This is so far away from the kind of politics that we have in our countries that you can barely make the stretch, can you? It just seems impossible. But it's important. I could offer you a few other smaller countries. Vanuatu, for instance, which is a very small Pacific island, regularly comes top of what is known as the World Happiness Index. Again, you may think that's a joke. It isn't. There are very serious academics who test for happiness across the world, and Vanuatu always comes in the top 3, and for the last 3 years has come top of the happiness index. I'm not really sure why. I don't think it's the lack of traffic lights, but I don't dare go any further than that. So there are a few countries which would register there. All I can tell you is this. In all these happiness indices, all of them, one thing emerges. Wealth, net wealth, has nothing to do with net contentment. Wealth is not the driver of contentment. Equity is the driver of contentment. It's an extraordinary thing. The countries that have the smallest gaps between rich and poor come top of the league. The countries that have the biggest gaps between rich and poor, that's America, UK, etc., come bottom of the league. So equity, justice, drives social contentment. This is the most powerful message that we can send out. And it's really important. So, I'm sorry, I'm going on far too long about this, but you've set me such impossible tests here, I don't know really where to go after this. Oh, I know, I wanted to end up by talking, what does that tell us about human nature? And you know, the funny thing is, in all these discussions about, and I think one of the questions from our colleagues was about this, in a way, implicitly about this, when you really get down to people's fears and doubts about sustainable development, and you sort of take them through all the argument, all the logic, all the economics, everything else, and you kind of proved that the modern paradigm of progress is finished and bankrupt, they'll still say to you, that's really nice, Jonathan, but that's not what human nature is all about. And it's the kind of final resort of a failed intellectual rebuttal of sustainable development. When you can't rebut sustainable development through marshalling facts or information or scientific evidence, what normally happens then at an argument is, you might be right. Sort of pat on the head. You might be right, but basically, you don't understand human nature. And human nature is predisposed to greed, self-interest, aggression, tribalism, short-termism, and a whole host of other genetically inherited characteristics that make it impossible for us to think about living in sustainable ways together. That's the theory. And boy, do they believe it strongly. And they will argue that Darwinism, social Darwinism, teaches us that we cannot possibly live together, 9 billion of us, living elegant, fair, decent, compassionate lives by 2050, because we are all creatures of the evolution of humankind, which caused us to grow and evolve through competitive, aggressive, sort of hateful, red in tooth and claw behaviors. This is very dominant, this view. Very dominant. It's not the fault of Darwin, by the way. It's the fault of Herbert Spencer, who was Darwin's principal acolyte and interpreted Darwin to the world, because Darwin was really not hugely good at going out and selling his ideas. But Herbert Spencer, he went out and he sold Darwinism to the Victorian politicians of his age and said, look, guess what? Darwin is telling you something which fits your political objectives perfectly, because your political objectives are all about naked, aggressive, self-interested, greed-driven forms of economic development. So guess what? We've got this wonderful man here called Darwin, who tells you that the evolution of life on Earth proves that your economic theories are correct. Incredible. And we still live with the consequence of that. So I just want you to think about this with human nature, and I want you to remember the true story of evolution, not told by Herbert Spencer, but told by wonderful academics in the world today, people like Lynn Margulis, Janine Benyus. Most of these people are women. Women do seem to understand evolution, usually rather better than some of the men who choose to interpret evolution. A fantastic school of thought that teaches us now with incredible authority that evolution is more about cooperation than it is about competition. More about cooperation than it is about competition. I want you to bank that little bit of analysis, because most people still think evolution is all about competitive, aggressive, seeking after space in your ecosystem. That is not what evolution tells us about the emergence of life on Earth. It really isn't. It's what politicians would have us believe, but it isn't. So, human nature isn't really like that at all. Human nature is in many respects completely different and will respond differently to different challenges in different contexts at different points in human history. And I still remain absolutely, unreservedly optimistic about the potential for humankind to respond to this crisis in very different ways from the ways that most social Darwinists would have us believe. And here's the final paradox. It may be the sheer scale of the threat to humankind that brings out this flowering of human nature. Just the utter desperation and severity and urgency of the challenge that actually leads to a different articulation of human nature.
Mr. Paxman, sir, you want to give some thoughts about?
I think this is Jonathan's conference rather than mine. Jonathan knows an awful lot more about these matters than I do, and I hesitate to take the floor at all. But as you were talking there, Jonathan, I was wondering what might happen to the human happiness index in Mexico City if the good citizens of Mexico were to decide to abolish traffic lights.
Good point.
I think there is perhaps a point in that I'd like to put in the form of a question to you, and that is really, we are where we are. We are now living in the 21st century, and on the whole, human society has moved on quite a bit since we were living in caves in the prehistoric time. And this really causes me to sort of wonder about the nature of progress and the nature of this thing that you were referring to, which is human nature. There is an awful lot that is bad in human nature. Greed, aggression, competitiveness, tribalism, those things that you've mentioned. But it strikes me that there is perhaps something good in human nature as well. And perhaps it is something that distinguishes us from the animal kind, which is the desire to make progress. And it is the desire to make progress, the desire to have, if you like, a better life that's brought about so many of the improvements that we have seen from the wonderful flourishings of the Renaissance to the huge improvements that we've seen in our ability to tackle disease, the huge advances that we've seen, good as well as some bad, in human technology. And it does seem to me that there is something deep in human nature that makes us want to improve our human condition. And that is good, and that is something that has to be fostered. The problem, it seems to me, is in distinguishing, if you like, and encouraging that positive trend and discouraging the belief that the desire to make progress inevitably means that we have to be richer, that we have to consume more, and that we have to compete more. It seems to me that sustainable development is more than just being the same. I don't think humankind can ever stay in the same place. I think humankind is condemned to try to make progress. And I think that so long as our population carries on expanding, we're also, I think, condemned to try to create more wealth, because if we don't create more wealth for an expanding population, then poverty is going to increase. So the question, it seems to me, is how do we achieve a balance between those two factors? How do we make our growth genuinely sustainable? And how do we curb and channel this human nature, this human instinct to make progress in such a way that it makes progress in a sustainable way, and not in a way that eventually condemns us all, if not to extinction, at least to living to a much poorer quality of life. And I think where I come down on all of this is not rocket science. It's education, isn't it? It's actually learning from a very early age and throughout life what human progress really means, and teaching our children and teaching ourselves that progress towards a better life has inevitably to mean progress towards a sustainable world, because if our world isn't sustainable, then the quality of our life is going to, and of our children's lives, is actually going to decrease. As I say, not rocket science, but tricky.
Yeah.
You know, I'm an Anglophile, and let me tell you why. There was a survey of students in Britain asking them about their happiness. Guess who was on the top? Mexican students. Yeah. Well, I just want to ask Phil Callahan, Defra. Defra is also a friend of LEAD, I think. So I want to, and Phil also, I want to ask Phil if he would like to have some comments. or you want to wait for a second round, or what would you like to do?
I think it's fair for others to, if
Yes?
there are other questions, come out
Okay.
to Jonathan.
There were some problems with the colleagues in the University of Guadalajara, but I think I'm going to give them a chance to come with some questions or comments now, and I want to thank Imelda, if she's listening to me, if she wants to organize a few comments in her audience, and then I will ask José Luis to have some comments. Okay.
Hola.
Just 1 minute.
Hola, hola. Ah. Sí. Hola, ¿me escuchan?
Perfectamente. A ver, ¿sabes qué? Vamos a pedirle a José Luis el primero de esta ronda. Vamos a hacer una ronda aquí de nuevo y vemos qué pasa con Guadalajara. José Luis, por favor.
Just a very short question to Jonathon. You said that cooperation is closer to human nature than competition. But cooperation is also a way of competition because society, like in the NAFTA agreement in the European Union, they cooperate to compete better. How do you explain this?
A ver, ahí, Norma, a ver si hay alguien aquí que quería.
¿Quién? ¿Ustedes? ¿Tú querías? Alejandro, ¿querías tú?
I'm not going to answer that.
Por favor, el nombre.
Ricardo Hernandez, lead fellow, and I am one of the 5 billion believers. And I'd just like to share a note of practical information. We're working in a project in Chiapas, promoting fair trade and biodiversity-friendly use of non-timber forest products of ritual use with the Alliance of Religions and Conservation. And this is important because prayer is actually bringing together consumers and producers, defeating the anonymous market, linking people with common values, even though they don't share a common religion, and improving the conditions of trade, and therefore the conditions of the creation and the fellow being, improving the living conditions in Chiapas, and improving the level of certainty of their gift to God in the case of the communities consuming this in Mexico, in the cities, in the US, and in Europe.
Hi, I am Alejandro from El Colegio. Well, I have one question here. You were saying there's a nice dilemma here. In one place we have the individual spirituality, and on the other hand we have to achieve trust for our politicians in order to function like a society, like an organism, right? So, well, it's a nice dilemma. In one hand, we have to make our individual work and to function as a whole. So, how can we start, or which will be like the starting point?
Norma.
I'm Fabrizio Miroziak from. I'm actually part of the lead generation. I'm also working with the embassy in some dialogue with the Congress, and I believe in spirituality. It's not about religion. I think it is different. Spirituality, it's about our relationship with each other and with all the species that are around us, our world. And I would say that in that terms, that the first thing we have to do in order to have a more satisfying environment is to listen to each other. I would say that that would be the first thing that we have to do in a spiritual way, is to listen to ourselves in what are our real needs. As you were saying, it's not about more money. It's having a good relationship with my wife, having a good relationship with my brother, with my boss, with everybody. And for that, the first step we have to take is to listen to each other. And maybe an exercise that we all can do in this next day is to ask someone that you have a relationship, ask him if you really listen to him or to her, and see what are the responses. Maybe you will know about some needs that you have not been listening because you have been listening to yourself. And I would leave it like that.
I am Fabiola Figueroa. I agree with this theory. In fact, rational choice theory says that cooperation is the real miracle in this human history. But it's not that much a miracle because it occurs all the time. All our economical system is based on it. The question here is that the one who makes these social movements that make possible development are always led by a certain group, a small group. So we might have to wonder if this small group receives some nature pressures. I mean, now that we are talking about this apocalyptic possible future. So these might be the solutions if this group receives these natural pressures. So it may again lead all this social change and economical change, and we might find a better way of trying to be in order and in harmony with nature.
I'm going to try again with Guadalajara. We have a little bit of a responsibility. I'm sorry, you have to be patient and cooperate with me. So, Imelda, you want to have some comments, and how have you organized? You have a few minutes to intervene, please.
Okay. Are you listening me?
Sí.
Are you listening? Yes. It's a pleasure to have this video conference with this distinguished panel. And the question is, from your perspective, what role do the people play in the sustainable development? And the second, the second question is, what role do local governments have to play in the formation of the sustainable and development? And only the third question.
¿Sabes lo que pasa, Imelda? Tú tienes el micrófono muy pegado a tu boca, y por esa razón quizá no estamos entendiendo cómo lo que estás diciendo. No sé si me estás escuchando, pero no entendemos porque estás demasiado. Retira un poquito el micrófono, a ver si ahora podemos tener mejor comunicación y mejor sonido, si me haces favor.
Ok, ¿ahora sí me escuchan?
Y puedes, no te preocupes si te escuchamos o no, preocúpate por favor de tu comentario, y lo que quiero decirte es, puedes hacerlo en español si gustas, porque aquí vamos a traducir lo que nos estás diciendo.
Ok, la pregunta es, desde su perspectiva, la participación ciudadana, ¿qué papel juega o qué ponderación le dan en el desarrollo de un desarrollo sustentable, ¿no? Básicamente es una. Y dos, ¿qué acciones a nivel local se pueden implementar para ser detonante junto con la ciudadanía, como ser el pivote del desarrollo a nivel local, ¿no?
Gracias.
Básicamente es eso.
First question relates to public participation. What do you think about that? The second question relates to local actions, and what do you think, what kind of a role do you think local actions as well as public participation would have in achieving a better life and getting closer to sustainability? So, please.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Firstly, I have to deal with my pupil here. It's really, this whole thing about competition and competitiveness is so important because it does, as you said, it dominates conventional economic theory. Success depends on increased competitiveness. Most countries have competitiveness strategies to make sure they're really being as competitive as they can. I just want to answer your question by reminding you of the etymology, the root of the word competition, which is helpful. I know it's a bit boring when people remind you of the etymology of words, but on this occasion it's helpful because it is a Latin root, and it comes from the Latin of com, with, and petari, which is to strive. And the word competition does not mean beating the crap out of each other. The word competition means to strive together to achieve something. And if you look at the use of the word competare in Latin documents, should you have a few spare moments, you will find that it is actually, it talks about the ways in which people in society strive together to achieve a combined societal goal. And even in the context of the games and the sort of very competitive games they used to have, the whole purpose was athletes would strive together, not to do each other down, but to create a higher sense of achievement for humankind as a whole. So we've lost that, of course. I'm just sounding like a nostalgic idiot to think that we could ever get back to that understanding of competition, but I sometimes like it. I sometimes remind myself when I'm talking to red in tooth and claw capitalists that they actually don't really know what competition is. I sort of take a bit of comfort from that. So, can I come first to the question from Guadalajara about participation and local action? I think if as you can see, I'm really trying this evening to be at my optimistic best. There is a sort of natural, congenital behavior in sustainable development people to be very gloomy and to only think they've done a good job if they take people's energy levels down so that you all go away feeling truly depressed. Well, this evening we're trying to do it a bit different. And one of the things that keeps my spirit up is this astonishing resurgence of grassroots, community-based, local action all around the world. And I can't speak with authority about what's happening here, although even from what I read about Mexico, and I have some very good friends here who sort of help me understand a bit about Mexico, even from what I know about this, there is this sense that nobody any longer needs to get permission from somebody else to find ways of leading a better, more sustainable life in their own community at the local level. And if I speak a bit about Europe, where local action has been sort of the poor relation of sustainable development for many, many years, because it's all been done by nation states and by big business and all the big institutions in society. Right now in Europe, you will see an incredible flowering of local grassroots groups, just basically saying, sort of move over. We've got the picture, we know what this means, we know we're going to have to lead low carbon lives. We know we're going to have to think more carefully about where we get our food from. We know it would be a good thing if we could actually start producing a bit more of our own food. We know it isn't sensible to buy tons of things that create mountains of waste that then mess up the environment. We know all this now, intuitively as much as logically, and we're going to try to do something about it ourselves in our community. So I'm hugely inspired at the moment by the sense of communities resurgent in a world that has become top-heavy and over-centralized. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. A lot more of people simply saying, this isn't so difficult. You just make it so difficult for all of us. And actually, we can do a lot more of this ourselves. So that, for me, is something I'm watching very carefully. And of course, it is very dependent on increased levels of participation, as I think you were suggesting. Increased engagement by civil society. Okay, so I have to now answer my colleague's question here, the ambassador's question, which of course is nightmarishly difficult, as he knows, which is, what do we do with progress, with this sense of the restless spirit of humankind? Can you arrive at a sustainable world and still be true to the dynamism in humankind? Because we are a fiercely dynamic species. We do actually celebrate change a lot. We love the notion of thinking things differently. We're curious, we're innovative, we're very creative in that sense. When J.S. Mill, John Stuart Mill, brought out his astonishing work about the stationary state, about the notion that one day growth would have to come to an end. This is written in 1861 or wherever it was. I'm bad at dates, but somewhere around there. And he sort of said, you know, at some stage in the future, the kind of economic paradigm we have now is going to have to come to an end. It just is. We're going to have to do things differently. And he conjured up this notion of the stationary state, in which human beings would seek then to meet their needs, this desire to improve their lot, without the constant increase in economic turnover. He was ruthlessly criticized by the establishment of that time on precisely the grounds that Giles is talking about here, that this would somehow suppress the human spirit. It would cast everybody into a miserable, static zone of mediocrity. And we'd never be able to flourish by growing differently, by developing the human spirit. So we have a dilemma here, and actually sustainable development activists need to address this dilemma, because everybody thought that this journey over the next few years, we're going to get to this place called sustainability. And then once we get to sustainability, we're going to stay there forever. For the rest of the life of human beings on this planet, we're going to get there and then we're going to stay there. And this does not sound very appetizing, does it? Let's be absolutely honest. This is not exactly a winner in psychological, philosophical, or political terms. So how do you square this circle? How do you reconcile this philosophical, psychological conundrum, this dilemma? And I don't know what brought this into my mind, but George Bush came into my mind at that moment. And this is a weird thing, because actually I'm so happy that George Bush does not come into my mind very often these days. I mean, it's just wonderful to have my mind freed of the scourge of George Bush, who has unfortunately dominated most of my negative feelings for 8 years. But George Bush, what made me think about this was that in one of his rare moments of perverse insight, after he made the State of the Union address, in which he owned up to America's addiction to oil. Do you remember that astonishing moment where George Bush gave the State of the Union address and said, this nation is addicted to oil? And some speechwriter was being shot out the back the very moment he uttered these words. And he gave 2 speeches after that, and it was the first time that George Bush has ever indicated he had any interest in climate change at all. And in one of these speeches, he allowed himself to have a sort of techno dream. I was about to make some analogy here, but a big techno dream, in which he conjured up a vision where human beings would find a new technology to place reflecting mirrors in outer space to beam down concentrated solar power onto the planet, where we would build these receptors of intense radiation from the sun, beamed from these arrays, huge arrays, countless square miles of solar arrays in outer space, beam down limitless amounts of solar power to planet Earth. And in this speech, this is rather touching, George Bush said, I can't believe that the environment movement is going to be opposed to this idea, because it will give us unlimited, clean, renewable energy forever to free humankind, or mankind. And I kind of listened to this thing. I thought, God, this is amazing, George. How did you get to that point? I mean, you got to the point via a really weird excursion, okay, which is a sort of insane, crazy geoengineering idea, which will never, ever happen, as we all know. But via that excursion into the outer realms of techno-insanity, he sort of surfaced a really important point, which is what would happen to our sustainability story if we could find energy on a literally limitless basis, with literally no impact on the physical environment, deliverable to everybody anywhere in the world, whatever their state of poverty or wealth. Would we still be unhappy about this? Is there something about people like me who actually don't really want to have a world of plenty and wealth and richness and aspiration and all the rest of it? Would I get really grumpy about it and say, oh no, that's awful, we don't want any of that completely free, clean, renewable, liberating energy, because that's rubbish. That'll still lead to the subjugation of the human spirit, etc., etc. This was quite a philosophical challenge for me, and I must admit, George Bush did not challenge me philosophically very often. But it goes to the heart of what do we mean by progress? Because if this was a deliverable into our world, would that be such an awful thing that we'd sort of turn away from it because it was a techie fix? Because it didn't quite meet the deeper dimension that I've been offering you this evening? And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I actually think that technology, that moving the entire energy system of the world from electrons to photons, is probably the nature of the revolution we're going to go through. There is no limit to the amount of photons arriving on planet Earth. Well, there is a limit, actually, but it's a very large number, and it's infinitely more than we need on a daily basis. If we learned to trap that flow of photons to meet the needs of humankind, a huge part of our problems would be sorted out in that regard, but not all of them. And that brings me to the very first question. It is my last comment, because I don't believe that would really get us quite to this sense of living differently, living better, living more fairly, living more compassionately. And I think the first question that you asked at the back there was, how do we learn to progress, to grow, to develop through the paradigm of being rather than the paradigm of having? And one of the most important books in my life was a book written by a psychologist, a man called Erich Fromm, who I suspect you may know about, who wrote this book. And when you said that earlier this evening, it brought it straight into my mind. An astonishing book called To Have or To Be. And that for me was one of the first kind of indications of a tectonic plate clash going on, because we are in a to have culture. We are, all our concepts of betterment, improvement, progress, growth, development, they're all geared to the have, to the metrics of to have. And in a way, the other paradigm is to the metrics of to be, to grow and progress through the evolution of the human spirit and our minds and our brains and our culture and our artistic, astonishing artistic brilliance. And I just think we can move progress out of crude volumetric material metrics into a metric that is about growth of a very different kind. And that's sort of the challenge that philosophers and psychologists and artists and faith leaders and politicians, that's sort of the challenge we've got, is how do we move the sense of what's important to us in life out of the to-have paradigm into the to-be paradigm? And how do we do that fast enough? I don't know, is the answer to that. But I know it'll have wonderful bits to it, including the relationship with the natural world. I failed to answer the question about better relationship with the natural world. I would just leave you with the thoughts of the wonderful American biologist, a man called E.O. Wilson, incredible scientist, amazing man, who wrote a book called Biophilia. And this is a Greek word. And in this word, biophilia, in which he wrote this most elegant little treatise in which he said, human beings have spent the last 300 years trying to beat nature out of them. Literally. putting concrete between themselves and the living world, creating barriers between themselves and the living world, sort of setting up complex supply chains so that nobody knows where their food comes from, nobody really knows where their electricity comes from, nobody really knows where their water comes from. So putting distance, barriers between ourselves and everything that nature gives us. And that we've called civilization. 200 years worth of beating nature out of humanity. And he said, and so I'm trying to find the right quote, but I can't quite remember. He said, it's the most forlorn exercise that humankind has ever engaged in, because you cannot root out nature from humankind. We are inexplicably embedded in and intricately connected to everything in nature, and nothing we do will ever change that. And he talked about biophilia, this upwelling of the natural in us, as an antidote to the really crude and sad concretization of our lives that many of us have had to suffer. So that's quite exciting too, really. He even said that people who play golf are expressing their love of nature. I think that's going too far. Personally, I don't think that's good, but he was trying to be inclusive and open up this different vision of the world even to golf players. So, you know.
Bueno, espero que ustedes todos, igual que yo y aquí todos los que estamos aquí en esta mesa, se sientan satisfechos de haber tenido la oportunidad de oír a este señor, a Jonathon Porrit, y haber oído también al señor embajador. Y creo que nos acercamos, fue un pasito para sentirnos más satisfechos y mejorar nuestra vida, así lo siento. Así siento esta sesión y les agradezco mucho a todos ustedes. Tanto les agradezco que los voy a invitar a un vinito aquí junto, por favor. Entonces damos por terminado. Thank you very much, Jonathon. I just said that I thank them so much that we're going to invite them to have a glass of wine. Excellent. Okay? Thanks very much. Bye-bye.